The corridor was not entirely dark. A single candle burned in the sconce at the far end, throwing a warm, unsteady light across the floorboards, and Cecily kept close to the wall as she moved, one hand trailing the wainscoting, her footsteps as quiet as she could make them in shoes that were half a size too small. The gray dress caught at her ankles. She had tucked the white apron into its waistband to keep it from rustling. She had almost reached the blue bedroom when she heard Edmund's voice through the closed door. She did not stop walking. She had learned 2 years ago that stopping was what people noticed. The voice continued, low and satisfied. And then a woman's laugh answered it. Cecily had heard that laugh at dinner. It belonged to a widow in pale silk who had been seated on Edmund's left and who had leaned toward him across the breadth of the fish course with the confidence of someone who knows precisely how welcome she is. Cecily paused at the end of the corridor, 2 feet from the door, and pressed her fingertips to the wainscoting. She was not yet certain what she needed. She needed to be certain. The latch lifted. She turned, and the candle from inside the room threw light across the corridor, and 3 feet away from her stood a man she recognized immediately. Nathaniel Vane, Earl of Sorley, was still fully dressed. He held his own candle at his side, and the flame moved in the sudden draft from the opened door. And his gray-green eyes found her face, and then dropped to her wrist, where a small silver thimble hung on a ribbon. He said nothing. The door opened wider. She did not move. Nathaniel, with a stillness that read as composure and was something else entirely, stepped back into the shadow of the doorway to his own room and drew the door half closed so that she was no longer visible from the corridor's candlelit end. She stood there, in her gray dress and her 2 small shoes, with the thimble at her wrist and her heart audible in her own ears. She could hear Edmund's voice receding, moving toward the window. The door did not fully open. After a long moment, she walked away, quietly, in the direction of the servants' stairs. Behind her, Nathaniel's candle went out. She had come to Ashmore Hall as a bride in the October of 1813, and she had understood the terms of the arrangement before the carriage reached the gates. Her father's estate in Wiltshire had been comfortable, but not wealthy, and Edmund Ashmore had inherited a name and a house that required an infusion of capital that his charm alone could not provide. She was 22. She was considered handsome in a quiet way that the London season had not quite known what to do with, and she had a dowry of £4,000 and a nature her aunt described as sensible, by which her aunt meant that Cecily did not require to be managed in public and could be trusted to behave correctly, even in circumstances that were not correct. Edmund had been pleasant during the 3 months of their courtship. He had not been cruel. He had simply never been interested. He wanted the dowry and the appearance of a settled household, and he had obtained them, and the transaction had been completed in the drawing-room of Ashmore Hall on a Tuesday morning in November, with Fitch in attendance and the Dowager presiding in her chair at the window, as if she were witnessing an inventory rather than a marriage. Cecily had signed what was placed before her. She had worn her best gown, which was cream with a blue sash, and Edmund had looked at her the way a man looks at a new piece of furniture, assessing whether it will do, and concluded that it would. The carriage that had brought her from Wiltshire departed the same afternoon. The Dowager had assessed Cecily on her first evening in the house. She had done it with the same thoroughness and the same visible indifference with which she assessed the new fire screen that had arrived from London the same week, and she had arrived at roughly the same conclusion. Adequate to its purpose. Not worth particular attention. Cecily had stood in the entrance hall in her traveling dress with her trunks on the stone floor around her, and the Dowager had descended the staircase in navy silk and looked her over from the threshold. "She is a decoration," The Dowager had said to Fitch, in the small sitting room 2 days after the wedding, while Cecily moved quietly in the adjacent library, invisible to them through the half-closed door. Edmund required something ornamental for the drawing room. She will do well enough. A pause, in which Cecily heard the small sound of the Dowager setting down her teacup. Though I doubt she will last. A woman with so little to say for herself tends to be replaced before long. Fitch had not replied. He was a cautious man whose caution was his defining quality. Cecily had said nothing either. She had stood very still on the other side of the door, with a book in her hands, and she had decided then that she would learn this house with the thoroughness of someone who intended to survive it. She would learn where the real authority lived, and where it was merely performed. She would learn the names of the servants, and the names of the guests, and the name of whatever had been in Edmund's eyes the first time he looked through her, as if she were glass. 2 years. She had learned which floors creaked, and which did not. She had learned which servants reported to Edmund, and which reported to the Dowager, and which reported to no one, because they had ceased to be noticed long enough ago that they had reverted to their own quiet loyalties. Agnes fell into the last category. Agnes had been the housekeeper at Ashmore Hall for 31 years, and had outlasted 2 baronets, and was thoroughly at peace with the prospect of outlasting a third. She had a specific quality of stillness when she was in Edmund's presence. The stillness of a woman who disagrees, but is too senior to be dismissed, and too necessary to be overruled, and who is waiting. The shooting party had arrived on a Thursday. 12 guests, mostly gentlemen Edmund had collected from London, and their wives and dependents arranged around the edges of whatever occasion Edmund was presiding over. The house filled in the way houses fill with parties of that kind, with luggage and noise and a great deal of movement from the stables, and Edmund conducted it all with the expansive good cheer that was his particular gift, and that Cecily had come to understand as a performance entirely independent of his actual feelings. Nathaniel Vane had come up in his own carriage and had been given the East Wing room, and Cecily had seen him arrive from the window of the morning room, and had noted that he dismounted the way men who had spent time in difficult places dismounted, without ceremony, not looking around to see who was watching. He handed the reins to a groom and stood for a moment in the courtyard with his coat open in the autumn air, looking at the house in the particular way some people look at buildings they have reservations about, and then he went inside. She knew him by reputation and by the occasional proximity of neighboring estates. He was considered cold. He was considered principled, which the county treated as a milder form of the same complaint. He had refused the match his mother had pressed for 3 years ago, though the young woman in question was well connected, and the arrangement had seemed settled to everyone except him. He had not remarried after his family's expectation that he would do so, and this was held against him in drawing rooms where Cecily herself had been assessed and found merely ornamental. At dinner on the Thursday, he had been seated across from her, and had spent the soup course in conversation with the gentleman on his left, and the fish course in apparent silence, and then had looked up at precisely the moment she was looking at him. And they had both looked away again with the quick, mechanical neutrality of 2 people who are pretending they were not looking. Edmund, at the head of the table, had been watching Mrs. Helena Voss. Mrs. Voss had arrived the same afternoon as Nathaniel, in the Dowager's own carriage. Cecily had understood the implication immediately and completely, with the same quiet clarity that had served her through 2 years of being the decoration of a house that no longer required decorating. She had stood in the entrance hall and watched Mrs. Voss descend from the Dowager's carriage in pale blue silk, with the ease of someone who had descended from carriages in front of favorable audiences many times. And she had noted the particular warmth of the Dowager's greeting, and she had understood what she was looking at. That evening, at dinner, She had sat at Edmund's right hand and watched him watch Mrs. Voss across the table. He had not bothered with discretion. He had the carelessness of a man who has decided that his wife's perceptions are not worth managing. She had made her decision then. She would not leave quietly. She would not be displaced without grounds, without recourse, without the specific evidence that might make her circumstances legible to a solicitor. She had £4,000 that had gone somewhere inside the Ashmore estate, and she meant to know where it had gone. And she meant to leave this house on terms she had negotiated, rather than terms Edmund had selected for her. It was Agnes who provided the gray dress. Cecily asked for it on the Saturday morning, at the back of the linen press in the corridor near the kitchen staircase, where the older servant's clothing was folded in a cedar chest with sprigs of dried lavender. Agnes had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who understands the shape of a situation without requiring its details, and she had said, "There are the plain gray ones in the press, my lady. They are too small for any of the girls now, and I have been meaning to mend them." Cecily had said, "I will take one." Agnes had said, "Yes, my lady," and had turned back to the linen without another word, and Cecily had taken the gray dress and the white apron and gone back upstairs, and neither of them spoke of it again. The house at night had a different character than the house in daylight. In daylight, it was Edmund's house entirely, his hunting party filling the dining room and the gun room and the stables, his mother's voice in the morning room arranging the social weather of the coming day, Mrs. Voss established in the drawing room like a piece of furniture that had been moved from its original position and placed somewhere more flattering. In daylight, Cecily moved through the house as its mistress and was looked through as its decoration, and those two facts existed simultaneously in a way she had grown fluent in managing. At night, in the gray dress, she was no one. The first night, she had gone only as far as the east corridor. She had not heard enough. The second night, she had heard Edmund's voice through the blue bedroom door, low and easy and at home. The third night, she had met his eyes in the candlelit corridor and seen him step back into shadow to conceal her, and she had not known what to make of it. And she had spent the following morning arranging herself at breakfast, as if nothing had occurred. He had come down at the same time and taken his tea without speaking to her and without looking at her, and she had looked at her own hands on her cup and tried to assess what she had seen in his face the previous night. She could not quite name it. She had been given too few examples of the thing to recognize it with certainty. At the first public moment, when the dowager had arrived in the morning room and held court, Nathaniel had stood near the window reading a letter, and Cecily had stood near the writing table composing one, and across the room the dowager had made a remark about the arrangements for the following evening's dinner. And Nathaniel had raised his eyes from his letter for a moment and looked at Cecily, not at the dowager, at Cecily, as if he were checking something. She had looked away. She had not known what she was supposed to do with someone who checked on her without being asked. At dinner that evening, Nathaniel was placed at the wrong end of the table. She did not know that he had noticed, but she noticed. The dowager had drawn up the seating arrangement herself, and had placed two elderly guests at the cold end near the window, and had put Nathaniel between them, partly because he was not a man whose company she cultivated, and partly because she wished to keep the upper end of the table for the constellation of Edmund, Mrs. Voss, and the guests whose opinions were considered socially consequential. Cecily looked at the placement card for a long moment after the dowager had left the dining room. The two elderly guests in question were Sir George Makepeace and his wife, who were both past 70 and had known Edmund's father, and who had been placed at the far end of the table where the windows were set too high to keep out the draught and where the fire's warmth did not reach. She understood that this was not an oversight. The dowager was a precise woman, and her seating arrangements were always legible to anyone willing to read them, And what this one said was that Sir George and his wife were present as a courtesy to the previous baronet's memory, and need not be made comfortable. She moved 3 cards. She moved them with the same steady hands she brought to everything, without hurrying. The elderly guests came nearer the fire, nearer the conversation, nearer the warmth that was theirs by every reasonable measure. Nathaniel's card moved to a position that gave him a view of the room, rather than a view of a curtained window. Mrs. Voss remained. Edmund remained. The net effect was that the dowager's architecture was intact in every element that mattered to the dowager, and the people who would have been cold would be warm, and the cost of the adjustment would fall entirely on Cecily if the dowager noticed. She did not move the candlesticks quickly enough. Nathaniel was standing in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. She did not know whether he had arrived at the end of the adjustment or at its beginning. He was very still in the way. He was always still, which was to say that it was a considered stillness rather than an accidental one. The stillness of a man who has decided to watch something rather than interrupt it. He had not said a word. He looked at the cards for a moment, and then at her hands still resting on the edge of the table, and then at her face. His expression did not change. She had no way of reading what the stillness meant. She covered the shifted positions with the candlesticks, moved them a half-inch to obscure the obvious gap in the pattern, and straightened. "My lord," she said. He said nothing. He stepped back from the doorway to allow her to pass. She walked past him out of the dining room, as if she had simply come in to retrieve something she had forgotten. She did not look at his face as she passed him. She was aware, in the way she was aware of a great many things she did not have permission to rely on, that his gaze followed her into the corridor and held there for a moment after she had gone. The dowager noticed the seating adjustment at 6:30 the following evening, when she descended to the dining room to supervise the final arrangements. She did not address Cecily directly. She stood at the end of the table and examined the cards with the expression of a woman who has found the page of an account book altered. And then she said to the footman, "Tell Lady Ashmore that I would like a word in the morning room." And the footman relayed this message, and Cecily received it, and went, and was told in precise and polished terms that the management of the dinner seating was the dowager's domain, and had been for 30 years, and would remain so. Cecily said, "Yes, ma'am," and did not alter her expression, and went back to her correspondence. Sir George and Lady Makepeace sat near the fire that evening, and were warmer for it, and nobody at the table explained why, and Nathaniel ate his dinner in the more central position, and did not look at Cecily any more than he usually did, which was not often, and with the specific care of someone who is not doing it. The 4th night, she went back to the corridor. She needed dates. She needed specificity. She had spoken to Agnes in the kitchen, and understood that Mrs. Voss had visited Ashmore Hall 3 times in the preceding 8 months, and had been given the same room each time. She was in the corridor for 17 minutes, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned and found Nathaniel 3 paces away. He was holding a candle. He looked at her in the gray dress and the white apron. His gaze stopped at her wrist. She held very still. Her pulse was audible behind her collarbones, and she hoped that fact was not visible in the candlelight, which it probably was. "That is your mother's," he said quietly. He meant the thimble. She said, "You knew my mother." Briefly. "She was kind to my sister." Neither of them moved. Down the corridor, something small shifted. A draft or a settling of the old house, and the candle flame bowed and straightened and held. She was very aware of the distance between them, 3 paces, the gray dress and the apron and the 2 small shoes. Her hair pulled back to anonymity. She had been effective in this disguise, because no one had been looking for her in these corridors, because no one at this party was looking for her anywhere. "I am not going to ask you what you are doing," he said. She said, "That is wise of you, my lord." "I am going to ask," he said, and paused, choosing with visible care, "whether you have what you need." She looked at him for a moment. In the gray dress, with her hair pulled back and the apron and the two small shoes, she felt the specific absurdity of the situation settle over her without any mercy. She was the lady of this house, dressed as its servant, conducting an investigation into her own husband, under the eyes of a man she had spoken to perhaps 7 times in her life. She was 24 years old, and conducting herself with the composure of someone who had not spent the previous hour listening at a closed door. She was aware, suddenly, of how tired she was. Not of the hour. Not of the years. "Not yet," she said. He looked at the door she was standing near, and then back at her face. "Then tell me what would help," he said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who gives orders in order to prevent larger problems, not in order to demonstrate authority. She said, "I need Agnes to know which nights the corridor is clear." He said, "I can provide that." She looked at him. "You should not involve yourself, my lord." He said nothing for a moment. In the silence, she became aware of the weight of the house around them, the dowager in her rooms at the West End, Edmund behind the blue bedroom door, the 12 guests distributed through the east wing in degrees of sleep, and this particular corner of the corridor with its one moving candle and 2 people standing very still in it. He was standing close enough that she could see the specific character of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who is indifferent, though she had read it as indifference at the dinner table and in the drawing room and a dozen times across the public rooms of the house. It was the stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself very carefully, because the alternative is something he is not ready to name. She knew that kind of stillness. She practiced it herself. "I had a sister," he said, and then stopped. He had said it quietly, and without any of the preparation that normally preceded difficult disclosures, and something in the way it stopped told her that the sentence had been longer in his mind and had broken against the difficulty of the air between them. She had heard that break before, in rooms where grief was being managed in front of witnesses. "Her name was Clara," he said. His voice had not changed. His face had not changed. Both were very controlled, and the control was the thing she heard. She looked at him and let him be looked at. The candle between them moved again in the house's small, invisible breath, and the light caught the side of his face, the strong jaw, the slight hollowness at his temple where the old scar was, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had been trying not to be aware of it for 4 days. "Clara married a man who did not notice her," he said. The words were even as a recitation, as a fact he had stated to himself many times in private. "I had reservations about the match. I did not act on them. I believed it was her choice and not my business." He paused. "She died in her 2nd year. She was taken with a fever while her husband was away, and the doctor was not summoned in time." He said it flat and precise, stripped of every feeling except the one that does not move no matter what. "I found out afterward." She stood still. "I know," she said, though she had not, until this moment, known that he was thinking of Clara. She had heard that his sister had died. She had not known the shape of it. He looked at her, and she let him look. There was something in his gray-green eyes that she had not been able to name in the drawing room or at the dinner table, and that she could name now. It was the look of a man who recognizes a situation and is deciding whether he will be, this time, the person who acts. He said, "Come inside. The corridor is not safe past 11 o'clock. She shook her head. "I am nearly done. Cecily." Her name, in his voice, in the dark corridor, was a thing she had not been prepared for. He had used it quietly, and without ceremony, the way a person uses a name they have been carrying for some time before they permit themselves to say it aloud. She felt it in her chest, the warm, specific shock of being addressed as herself rather than as the decoration, or as Lady Ashmore, or as my dear, which was how Edmund said her name when he meant something else entirely. Her hands, which she kept still as a matter of principle, went very still. "Come inside," he said. She went. If you have stayed with this story until now, there is something I should tell you, which is that the next hour will not go easily. Leave your comment below if you know what it is to stand inside a situation that requires courage before anyone has given you permission to have it. The drawing room the following morning was full of light and the particular social weather that descends on a large house party in its fourth day, when the initial social architecture has settled and the guests have organized themselves according to their real alliances rather than their assigned seating. Mrs. Voss stood near the fire with Edmund's mother, and the two women had the appearance of having been arranged there for years. Nathaniel sat near the window with a book he was not reading. Cecily came in at 10:30 and moved to the writing table in the corner, where she had left her correspondence the previous afternoon. She was aware of the dowager's gaze finding her and cataloguing her, in the particular way the dowager catalogued things she considered peripheral. "Cecily, dear," the dowager said, in the voice she reserved for instructions dressed as endearments, "you look as though you have not slept. You really ought to have the housemaid attend to you more carefully before you appear downstairs." Mrs. Voss smiled at something she was examining in her hands. "A lady of quality," the dowager continued, for the benefit of no one in particular, "ought to look the part she has been given. A decoration that does not function as intended becomes a problem for the house." There it was. The third voicing arrived like a fact, not like a wound, though Cecily felt it the way she always felt it, in the small, steady place behind her sternum that had absorbed 2 years of similar assessments. Cecily looked up from her correspondence. She looked at the dowager steadily, and she looked at Mrs. Voss, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a tone that closed the subject without capitulating to it, and returned to her letter. Near the window, Nathaniel turned a page. She had what she needed. She had dates, 3 of them, recorded in her own handwriting in a locked letter case in her room. She had the name of the inn at Halford, where Edmund had met Mrs. Voss in the August of the previous year, extracted from a fragment of a letter she had retrieved from the wastebasket in the blue bedroom on the 4th night. She had Agnes, who had recorded things she had seen over 8 months in the careful shorthand of a woman who notices everything and tells no one, until she is asked in the right way. What she did not have was a legal structure. She did not know what her £4,000 had become inside the Ashmore estate, or what her rights were in a separation, or whether a baronet's wife had any practical recourse that did not require the cooperation of the man she was separating from. She had not known to ask before. She had not known that there was a question, because she had not known there was an answer. Fitch told her, on the Friday afternoon, in the estate office, where she went on the pretext of reviewing the household accounts for the December quarter. He had been diffident at first, in the manner of a solicitor caught between competing obligations, but she had placed her letter case on the desk and opened it, and Fitch had looked at what was inside, and his expression had shifted from professional caution into something that took her a moment to identify. It was relief. The relief of a man who had known a thing was wrong for some time, and had not been given a way to act on it. "Your marriage settlement, Lady Ashmore," he said carefully, "contains a provision that Edmund has not, I think, explained to you." She said, "He has not." Fitch opened the settlement on the desk between them. He showed her the clause. A certain property in Bath, a small townhouse in the Crescent. that had come into the settlement as her own separate holding, not folded into Edmund's estate, not subject to his management. She had been standing in a house that was not hers for 2 years. She had not known she owned one. The dinner that evening was a constrained affair. Edmund had learned from Mrs. Voss, who had seen a shadow in the corridor on the 4th night, and had told him what she observed. Edmund was a man who managed his temper through social performance, and the performance at dinner had been very good, all surface warmth and correct behavior. But afterward, when the ladies had withdrawn and the gentlemen had been returned to the drawing room, he had said her name across the room with a particular flatness that told her the conversation was not going to be private. "My wife," Edmund said to the room in general, though his eyes were on her, "has been amusing herself this week in a way that I find, frankly, troubling." He smiled. The smile was for the room, not for her. "She has been moving through the house after dark, dressed in the servant's clothing. Agnes has confirmed it. I would not ordinarily raise such a matter in company, but as I have witnesses here to her behavior, I think it is better addressed now." Cecily sat with her hands in her lap. They were perfectly still. The silver thimble was at her wrist, under her sleeve, where it always was. The room had gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something is being administered. "This sort of conduct," Edmund continued pleasantly, "is not something I can attribute to healthy spirits. I have been concerned about Cecily for some time. She seems to misapprehend certain things. I believe it may be wise to consult a physician about her management." "Management," the dowager said, from her chair by the fire, with the confirmation of a woman who had been waiting for this moment. "Edmund is quite right. A decoration that does not know its place cannot be left to find its own way. It becomes an embarrassment to the house." The room was not large enough to have corners. Cecily was aware of Nathaniel at the other end of it. She did not look at him. She said, "I understand what you are doing, Edmund." He raised his eyebrows. "My dear." "You are frightened," she said. Her voice was even. It was the voice she had developed over 2 years of being told her perceptions were incorrect. "I have been in the blue bedroom corridor 4 times this week. What I gathered there, and what Mr. Fitch has confirmed for me this afternoon, makes the matter of my management considerably less simple than you have represented." Edmund looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at his shoes. Then he looked up. He was a cautious man. He had been cautious his entire career, and would probably be cautious at his death. He also had a letter case in his mind, and a settlement document on his desk, and a certain kind of discomfort that had been accumulating for some time. And that discomfort was now pressing against his professional caution in a way he had not anticipated. "There are provisions, Sir Edmund," he said quietly, "in Lady Ashmore's marriage settlement that I believe you may have overlooked. And given what has been raised in this room this evening, I would feel it professionally necessary to ensure that Lady Ashmore is fully informed of her entitlements before any action is contemplated regarding her, management." The room was very quiet now. Mrs. Voss stood near the fireplace. She had the particular stillness of a woman revising her position. Cecily kept her hands in her lap, the thimble pressed against her wrist through the fabric of her sleeve, small and familiar and cold. Nathaniel had not moved since Edmund began to speak. He was standing near the window, where he had been standing for the previous quarter of an hour, and he had the face of a man who is deciding something. Then he moved. He crossed the room in the particular deliberate way of a man who does not walk fast when speed would look like agitation, and he stopped at Cecily's chair and offered his hand. She looked at it. She looked at his face. The room was watching. She put her hand in his. He said, not loudly, in the level register he used when he had decided something irrevocably. Miss Pemberton deserves better than what this house has made of her. He had used her maiden name. She felt the word go through her, like the first note of something she had forgotten she knew. Edmund said, "I beg your pardon." Nathaniel looked at him. There was no anger in it. There was something quieter than anger, which was the considered opinion of a man who has been watching a situation for a long time and has finally decided to name what he sees. Edmund said, "She is my wife." Nathaniel said, "I'm aware of that." He looked at Fitch. "I believe you were speaking of provisions." Fitch straightened very slightly. "I was," he said. The dowager's ivory fan was perfectly still in her hand. She had not spoken since her last voicing of her verdict on her daughter-in-law, and she did not speak now. And in the silence of her not speaking, the social authority she had been trading on for 30 years performed a subtle and irreversible renegotiation with the room. Mrs. Voss set down her glass. Edmund stood in the middle of the carpet and looked at the arrangement of the room, which had shifted around him without anyone's apparent consent, and said nothing more. Cecily's hand was still in Nathaniel's. She was aware of the warmth of it, the specific weight of a hand that was not commanding her or claiming her, but simply holding, in the plainest sense of the word, an offer made where everyone could see it. She breathed in. They left Ashmore Hall on the Saturday morning. Cecily went in her own carriage with Agnes beside her, and the letter case on the seat opposite. And 4 years of household possessions reduced to what could be packed in a reasonable time. Edmund did not come to the door. The dowager stood on the steps in her navy silk, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has found the page missing from a book she expected to finish. And she did not speak. Cecily looked at the house as the carriage turned down the drive. She had learned its floors and its corridors and its particular quality of silence in the middle of the night, and she did not owe it grief. The Bath townhouse was small and faced south, which meant that in the mornings the light came directly in through the front windows and lay in clean lines across the sitting-room floor. Cecily had not known this. She had not seen it in winter. The first morning she woke in it, she lay still for a long time and listened to the particular sound of a house that was entirely quiet because there was no one in it who wished her ill. The separation required months of Fitch's careful management, and Edmund made it difficult in the ways available to him, which were not as extensive as he had believed, because Fitch had been thorough in 1813 and had protected her settlement in ways neither of them had fully examined at the time. Her £4,000 came back to her in a reduced form, but it came back. The bathhouse was unambiguously hers. Nathaniel came in November. He came without announcement, which she had half expected, because he was a man who did not perform his intentions before he had decided on them. She was in the sitting room with her correspondence when Agnes let him in, and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway with his coat still holding the cold of the street, and his gray-green eyes finding her face with the particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize over the months since Ashmore Hall, as the way he looked at things he had been thinking about for a long time. She said, "My lord," he said, "I was in Bath." She said, "Were you?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he came inside and sat down in the chair across from her and did not speak again immediately. He looked at her wrist, where the thimble was on its ribbon, and then at her face. She said, "You drove from Sorley to be in Bath." He said, "It is not a great distance." It was, in fact, a considerable distance. She did not say so. Outside, November rain had begun to move across the city, soft and gray, and the light in the south-facing window changed with it, settling into a warmer register. The fire had been well built that morning. The room was quiet. He said, I would like, very much, to be in Bath more often. She kept her hand still in her lap, the thimble pressed against her wrist. She thought of him stepping back into shadow in the blue bedroom corridor, the candle going out, the morning he had sat near the window of the drawing room with a book he was not reading, and the specific weight of his hand offering to be held in a room full of people who were watching to see whether she would take it. She said, "I find I have no objection to company that knows how to keep quiet." Something moved in his face. It was brief and specific. And she had not seen it before. Or she had seen it once in the corridor, when she had said she was not yet done. And he had looked at her with an expression she had not had a word for. She had a word for it now. She held out her hand. Not the way she had held it out for him in the drawing room at Ashmore Hall, in front of everyone, with the necessity of the moment pressing her forward. She held it out here, in a quiet sitting room in a house that was hers, in November rain, without an audience, and without a reason, except the one that had been accumulating, quietly and without ceremony, since a candlelit corridor and a man who had stepped into shadow to cover her. Nathaniel took her hand. He turned it over, gently, and his thumb rested for a moment on the ribbon where the thimble sat. And he did not say anything because there was nothing either of them needed to say. And the fire had been well built, and the rain moved across the window in its soft gray way, and the room held them both in the particular warmth of a thing that has finally arrived at its right place. The thimble caught the firelight. It had always been too small to use. It had been her mother's. It was hers now. All of it was. If you found yourself inside Cecily's story today, leave a word below. Thank you for staying until the end.